When David came face to face with a giant wolf with a letter in its mouth in the middle of the highway one night, he thought he was hallucinating. But when he read the shocking contents of the letter, he sprang right into action. A man named David was driving along the highway on a starry night when he noticed something dark blocking the road. He stopped the car a few feet away, and that's when he saw something that made his blood freeze in his veins. A wolf sitting in the middle of the road, staring straight at him with its piercing eyes. David was about to start the car again and flee in the opposite direction, but that's when he noticed a letter in the wolf's mouth. There and then, he thought he was hallucinating. What could a wolf do in the middle of a highway with a letter between its teeth? Well, if he was going crazy, he might as well go all in. Plucking up all the courage he had, David jumped out of the car and slowly approached the wolf. The beast lowered his head and dropped the letter at the stranger's feet. That's when David learned something shocking that involved a man named Boris and a terrible situation. Boris was a veteran with a sad story. He had been deployed to Afghanistan to fight in the war. In the beginning, he couldn't have been more proud to serve his country. He felt that he was part of something much greater than himself. Unfortunately, his wife did not share his views. They were a newly married couple with their first baby on the way. When he was deployed the first time, the whole situation was rather overwhelming for her. So when Boris came back after his first deployment, still in one piece and in good health, she begged him to leave the army. Their daughter, Alenka, now a year-old, was too much for her to care for on her own. Boris didn't want to retire, so he went back on his second deployment. However, this time around, he wasn't as lucky. Tragedy struck in more ways than one. He had been on a routine check of their specified area when someone missed an IED. All Boris could remember was the loud bang and flash of light. When he awoke, he found himself in the hospital missing a leg. The other one had sustained terrible injuries, and some shrapnel was still embedded in some places. This meant that he would always run the risk of infection in some way or another. Once the news reached home, a second tragedy struck. Boris had been trying to get a hold of his wife for a few days, but he had been unsuccessful. That is, until he got a phone call from his mother. She told him warily that his wife had vanished and left Alenka in her care. Once his wife had heard of the tragedy that had befallen him, she had gotten overwhelmed and realized that she couldn't take care of him as well as the child. Boris reeled at the news of his wife leaving him. Now, not only did he have to deal with being disabled, but also had to take care of his daughter on his own. He knew he needed to get back to her as soon as he could. That poor baby had gone through too much already. As soon as Boris had completed his physiotherapy, he made his way back home to his mother's. Alenka was over the moon to see her father. He was her hero in every way. This only strengthened Boris's resolve to be a better dad. He and his daughter stayed with his mother for a few years, but he soon realized that the city was not the place for his little girl to grow up. He wanted her to feel free and enjoy the outdoors. So the father and daughter duo packed up the little they had and set off into the mountains to live in a little village. From the very first day, Boris knew he had made the right decision. Alenka rejoiced at all the space she had in their garden to run around and play. Boris had found a sweet little cottage on the outskirts of the village area, and he was able to accompany her to school every day. Their lives went on graciously in the little village. Boris formed a little patch of land to provide for himself and his daughter, and everyone seemed to welcome them nicely. The only problem Boris had to face was his daughter being lonely. In an ideal world, he would have had more children with his wife, and his daughter would have had siblings. But unfortunately, this was not meant to be. Alenka saw a simple solution to this problem, though. She just wanted a dog. This wasn't such a complicated request, but it brought back painful memories to Boris. He had trained a dog during his time in the army, and when it passed, he had felt devastated. He wasn't ready for another pup, and so he denied his daughter this luxury. He didn't want to see her heartbroken as he had been. However, fate had other plans for the pair. A little soul came across their paths when they were least expecting it. One Sunday, while they were on their weekly walk, they heard a faint cry. They walked toward the sound and found something startling. On the railway tracks in front of them was a tiny little gray bundle of fur. Alenka ran up to it before Boris could stop her. She scooped it up and brought it back to her father to see. There in her arms was the tiniest wolf pup he had ever seen. Without so much as a word, Alenka simply began walking home with her newfound friend. Boris could see the love she had for the sweet little animal and felt he couldn't part her from it. It wasn't long, though, before the wolf began to grow exponentially. Alenka called him Sergei. They were inseparable as a pair. Wherever she went, he followed. In some ways, it gave Boris complete peace of mind as he knew she would always be safe with a big wolf by her side. He spent lots of time training him, and because of his intelligence, he was very confident that the training would hold. He just didn't realize how vital it would soon become to him. Every day, Sergei would trot into the town at the same time to accompany Alenka home from school. It was a ritual that also helped Boris immensely, because he didn't have to labor down the road with his crutch every day. However, one day, when Sergei got to Alenka, she could tell immediately that something was very wrong. Sergei seemed very uptight and anxious. He jumped around her and moaned as if there was something wrong with him. It wasn't until she got home that she saw what the issue was. Her father was laying in bed, very pale. He could barely muster the energy to greet her as she entered his room. Alenka had seen him in the state before. An infection must have flared up in his leg, which meant he desperately needed medicine. She first checked that his fever wasn't too bad, then quickly made her way into town. There, she asked around for some help, but no one had what she needed. So, she went back home and asked her father what to do. He consulted her and said that the fever would pass and that he would soon be all right. However, he was very wrong. A few hours passed. Boris seemed to slip in and out of consciousness more frequently, and Alenka began to panic. Splashing him with cool water, she eventually managed to wake him up after hours of slumber. He weakly beckoned for a piece of paper and a pen. He wrote down something on the page and then folded it up. He then told Alenka to go to the highway and stop anyone driving by. If they were good-hearted, they would help. But before she could do anything, Sergei did the unexpected. He snatched the letter with his mouth and quickly made his way to the highway. And that's where he met a kind stranger named David, who was now reading the letter with his shaky hands. He could have put it back at the wolf's feet and left, but thankfully, he didn't hesitate to offer his help. David jumped back into his car and made his way into the village. He drove straight to Boris's house and helped Alenka get him into the car. Then, he raced off to the hospital to get Boris the treatment he needed. If it hadn't been for Alenka's beloved pet wolf, her father may not have survived the night. Sergei had returned their kindness for taking him in with his rescue efforts. It was certainly an event none of them would forget anytime soon, and an amazing demonstration of loyalty and love.